A challenge for you, please, in the comment section. Can anybody name anything that Rand Paul has achieved apart from making his neighbour famous? I'm totally serious. I've got a few clips up because all I can see Rand Paul does is gesticulate, moan, complain, and wave his hands up in the air and his head back and forth. But if you've got any evidence that he's done something of significant political achievement, comment section's all yours.
Mr. President.
Senator from Kentucky.
If this is winning, I'm getting tired of winning. GOP leadership declares that this bill is a victory. But not unless you define victory as adding over $1 trillion in new deficit spending. So really there is a debate, a big debate within the Republican Party. Which is more important? Is it more important to add $45 billion to military spending, or is it more important not to add $1 trillion in deficit to our overall debt? We now have a $31 trillion debt. We're adding over $1 trillion a year, and yet Republican leadership says this is a victory because we're getting more military spending. But it's a victory at what expense? Are we actually more secure? Are we more safe? Is our national security more protected by spending more on the military, or is our national security actually more threatened by incurring more debt? I would argue the latter. $31 trillion in debt is the #1 threat to our national security. It's the week before Christmas, and predictably, Congress is considering yet another $1.7 trillion spending bill. We haven't had a chance to see or even read. Last night at 1:30 in the morning, the text of this 4,155-page spending spree was released. If you thought Congress couldn't possibly spend more money than it did last year, you would be wrong. The omnibus increases spending by 10%. Compared to last year's budget. You would think that nearly 2 years of 40-year high inflation would create some hesitation. You would think that a looming recession, spurred largely by exorbitant government spending, would give this Congress pause. But instead of taking a minute to consider what a responsible federal government budget looks like, we are instead placed behind the barrel of a gun, forcing us to choose between letting government expire or blindly passing a $1.7 trillion spending package that not only does not balance, but in fact spends over 10% more than last year. How does Congress spend taxpayers' money? Well, here's just a few examples of how your government currently spends money. We found that they spent last year $2.3 million injecting beagles with cocaine. It seems that they were curious, their researchers were curious, despite the pain they inflicted on these dogs, they were curious to know if cocaine causes adverse effects. Guess what? Read the newspaper, read the news, look at the addicts across our country. You think you need to inject beagles with cocaine to know that cocaine's a bad deal? $700,000 was spent to study how male parrots attract their mate. Really? We've got people who go hungry in our country. We got people that are trying to get out from behind poverty, and we're spending $700,000 studying how male parrots attract a female. We spent $187,000 to study whether or not dogs help kids cope. Of course they do. Ask any pet owner. Any pet owner could have told you, and we would have saved the taxpayer $187,000. We spent $118,000 to study if a metal replica, a robot of Marvel Comics' evil warlord Thanos, could snap his fingers. $118,000, really. They apparently hired some dude to wear metal gloves and then try to snap his fingers. You know what? they found out that it's impossible to make a snapping sound with metal fingers. So robots of the world, be warned, it's hard to snap your fingers. While we continue to spend ourselves into oblivion, almost every single European nation is working to shrink their deficit. We routinely look to Europe and we say, look how liberal, look how big government, look how socialized, and yet most of Europe actually balances their annual budget. In 2019, 15 of 26 European countries ran budget surpluses. Another 8 European countries ran deficits of less than 3% of their GDP, while here in the U.S., in that same year, our deficit exceeded 6% of GDP. Europe is a glaring example that fiscal responsibility is possible. It's not a pipe dream. In fact, if we just cut our spending to what we spent in 2019, just 3 years ago, we would actually have a balanced budget today. Instead, we have jumped from a deficit that was 6% of our GDP to a deficit that is 12% of our GDP. We are adding debt at an alarming rate. We are adding debt at a greater pace than we ever have in the history of our country. Thankfully, some of our predecessors in Congress anticipated this lack of restraint, and they gave us some guideposts. They gave us some rules. They established guardrails and tools to keep our budget in check. For example, there is a rule called the Statutory Pay-Go Act, or PAYGO for short. It requires that if you have new spending, it has to be offset by cuts elsewhere in the budget or elsewhere in the spending bill. Despite equipping our government with this necessary tool, though, Congress, with almost every budget in recent history, abuses its power, spends like drunken sailors, and ignores the fact that a day of reckoning is coming. Unfortunately, Congress has virtually 100% of the time voted to waive the PAYGO requirements. The American people demand accountability for the damage the big government spenders are doing to our families and to our nation's economic well-being. I will not allow my colleagues to escape accountability by hiding behind 4,000 pages of legislative text. I therefore will raise a budget point of order as this bill comes to the floor that will put every member of the Senate on record as to where they stand on fiscal responsibility. Unfortunately, most of the senators, even if they share my sentiments, they know that this point of order will be waived. They think they can quietly vote this way and no one will notice. Well, when American voters finally notice that people here are saying one thing at home and doing another, are promising balancing budgets and promising that deficits do matter, and then come up here and vote the opposite way, one day the American electorate will wake up and vote these hypocrites out. There are many other points of order that can be raised on this. The budget rules are actually of some value if we would actually obey the rules. Some of the people, you see them in their states, they're at campaign rallies, they'll tell you at town halls, they'll tell you on the Senate floor that we absolutely must get spending under control. They'll tell you that the debt is a problem. They'll tell you that it's a terrible way to run government to have omnibuses. It's terrible to put $6 trillion together in one bill, release it at 1:30 in the morning, and pass it, and you can read about it and find out what is in it later. I suspect you will find a lot of promises, though, that will be violated as we vote on these PAYGO restrictions. Realize that this is the law. The law of the land says you can't do this. Congress, in passing this omnibus, is breaking the law. The statute says very clearly they cannot do this. The only way they actually can evade responsibility is they change the law. They say, oh, well, it'd be embarrassing to get rid of the law. We will waive the law. So we have laws for decades that could actually right our fiscal house and put us on a course towards balancing our budget, and the rules are waived. They disobey their own rules. Congress does a disservice to the economy every time it waives these points of orders. What good are these procedures if they're never upheld? What started as formal guardrails to keep fiscal health of this nation strong is now merely just a messaging tool with no real significance that allows senators to get away with making promises they never intended to keep. That is why, in addition to raising this point of order, I am introducing an amendment to reform our budget procedures by raising the threshold. Let's make it less easy for them to break the rules. Currently, 60 senators can break the rules. Let's make it 2/3. Let's make it 67 senators necessary to break the rules. Why? Because they're bankrupting this country. Both sides of the aisle. There's an unholy alliance between both parties. One party wants more welfare, one wants more warfare. It's either the military-industrial complex or the welfare-industrial complex. But what happens inevitably every year is spending goes up. People come and the journalists question, what will happen? What will happen with Christmas here? The only thing that is known to happen is this body, both parties, will continue to add to the debt. And there is a day when you wake up and the dollar is worthless. Right now, the dollar is losing nearly 10% of its value on an annual basis, but there is a day when it's 10% a day or 10% an hour. Great countries have succumbed to the destruction of currency, and it happens through debt, through deficit financing, and it's coming to us. There is a day of reckoning. Unless we wake up and say enough's enough, we're going to do the prudent and rational thing. We're going to balance our budget. It's time that we take our nation's health seriously, and it's time that we show concern for those who are being damaged and devastated by inflation. The inflation at the grocery store, at the gas pump, who does it hurt the worst? It hurts those on fixed income, senior citizens. It hurts the working class and the poor, those who have most of their expenditures that go towards consumption, towards their food and groceries and gas. People who spend 90% of what they earn on buying the stuff that allows them to live are the people that are decimated by inflation. So if there are people in this body who do care, who do really care about those who are struggling with the burden of inflation, the best way is quit digging the hole deeper, quit adding the debt, and do what even European countries can do, and that's begin to balance our budget.
Not compelled. In other words, not in response to the legal process.
No warrant, no subpoena. They're just supplying you information on their users.
I don't believe so, but I can't sit here and be sure of that as I sit here.
Can you give us a yes or no by going back to your team and asking? Because it's a very specific question, because if they are, it's against the law. The law, the Stored Communications Act, the Electronic Communications Privacy Act of 1986, prohibits providers from sharing electronic communications with any person or entity unless it's compelled. This was done to protect the privacy of people so we could feel like we can send an email or a direct message to people without having that information given over. It's a very specific question. Will you get with your team of lawyers and give us a specific answer? Because this is the law. If you're doing it, then we need to go to court to prevent you from receiving this information.
Well, I can tell you that I'm quite confident we're following the law, but what I will also
Well,
do
that's
is
not the
follow up
answer.
with-
That's
but-
not the
But I
answer.
will also follow up with you to make sure that we get you more information, more detailed information.
Is the FBI obtaining anonymous social media data and then using technical methods to pierce the anonymous nature of the data?
Anonymous social media data?
So you purchase data. People purchase data all the time, and we sort of tolerate it for advertisings and things because it's anonymous data. Are you purchasing what is said to be anonymous data through the marketplace and then piercing the anonymous nature to attach individual names to that data?
Right. But when you asked about anonymous data, I was thinking more in terms of
No, I'm talking about data that is out there, and are you purchasing data and then piercing the anonymous nature of that data?
So the manner in which we usually use the term commercial data is probably longer than I could explain here. But again, let me have a
So
one of our subject matter experts follow up with
you will not answer the question of whether or not you're attaching names to anonymous data.
I think it's a more complicated answer than I can give here.
So far, we're 0 for 2 with getting you to answer this, but you're pledging you will actually answer the question, because you have to realize the frustration. We'll write you a letter, and your team of lawyers will write back a 15-page letter that says nothing, and you won't answer the question. These are very specific. This is whether you're obeying the law, whether we can have confidence. I want to have confidence in the
We
FBI.
are obeying the law.
Well, you're saying that, but we won't tell us the answer.
I said
so.
we
So
would-
you have to
no,
say yes.
that's not what
yes,
I said.
No, you aren't telling me the answer, and the answer is: are you collecting data not compelled by a warrant? That would not be in compliance with the law, but you won't answer that you're not collecting that data.
I said two things. One, we're following the law, and second, that we would have somebody follow up with you with more detailed, specific.
So those are two
information.
specific questions. Are you getting data from them that's not compelled? And then are you piercing the anonymous nature of that technically? Are you receiving private messages from social media companies through the use of confidential human sources? From Facebook, social media companies. You have people working over there who you're paying or who are volunteering to give you information, even though it would be against the law for Facebook to do this. But now you're saying, well, we'll get around the law by using confidential human sources.
You mean, just to be clear, I'm following the question, you mean, in effect, recruiting a human source inside the company?
Exactly.
Yeah. No, I don't believe so. I think what we have had situations where we have confidential human sources, not employees of those companies, but who report to us on their own communication. So if the two of us had a communication and Secretary Mayorkas was a human source, he could report to us about what he is saying to me.
Once again, I'd like the answer to be more specific from your team. Not that I don't believe so, but that you are or are not using human confidential resources within Facebook. So we get back to the idea of whether or not you're getting information for them outside the warrant process, because the next question is, which you probably won't answer either, is, are you taking information that you're getting not through the warrant process and then going around and coming back and using that as a predicate for getting a warrant to actually get the information you've already been given?
I'm not sure I'm completely following the...
Basically, you get information that Facebook's volunteering. This has all been written up in the Post article. You're familiar with the Post article with the accusations. And the question is, are you getting information they're giving to you? They say, oh, somebody says January 6th was great. Here's information on this guy. Then you're taking it and then using it as a predicate to say, well, now let's go to the court and get a real warrant and get the information we already actually got without a warrant.
So we get tips and leads from all over the place, from members of the public, from businesses, from community leaders, from other government partners all the time. And we use the tips and leads that we get to often form predicates for law.
Are you getting tips and leads from Facebook and social media companies?
We get tips and leads from companies, absolutely.
Right. It includes private information.
But I'm not aware of us receiving any tips or leads.
Because see, here's the point: you may think it's just jolly well to get all this stuff without a warrant that people volunteer to you, but many of us are alarmed that you're getting this information that are private communications between people, because it is against the law. It's against the law for Facebook or social media companies to give it to you, but it's also against the law for you to receive it. So you're going to have to very specifically go back with your team and search over whether you're doing it, not just say, we're probably not, we obey the law, we're good people. Well, no, there are doubts, because this has been reported. Even the FBI, when you responded to the New York Post article, said that companies are referring information to the FBI with investigative value relating to foreign malign influence. Now, there'd probably be a great deal more tolerance about that if it's foreign malign influence, but the question is, are you also receiving information on so-called domestic? But what would that mean? Is someone questioning whether paper ballots are an accurate way of running election? Is that good enough for you to be getting our private information because we have a political beef with the way votes are counted or recorded in our country? Is that something that you're collecting information on? Are they giving you information on private things that you've told them, well, people who question the election, we want to hear about these people, and so then they're giving you this information? Are you receiving information?
I'll give you two classic examples that I think happen with some frequency. One, if we supply information to, say, Facebook or any number of other technology companies about foreign accounts, Russian intelligence service, for example, accounts, when they then look in their system for those accounts, they often find other accounts related to those, and they provide tips and leads back to us about those. That's one example. A second, would be a situation where a technology company encounters a threat of violence on their platform, on their services, and they provide tips and leads to us, and we follow up on those threats of violence.
And there's probably not a lot of disagreement about that. The question is when we start to talk about political speech. And that is the question, are you receiving things that could be interpreted? And we'd want to know, and if you're not going to admit to us, whether it's political speech, someone who questions the election, someone who is mad about something that is going on, but it's not saying they're directly going to commit violence. They're mad about things. What the New York Post article said is, yes, you're getting this. And then when they're finally read in context, and this is from a whistleblower, which makes us suspect you're not being forthcoming or honest with us, is that whistleblowers are saying you are receiving this information from Facebook and others, and that you are going around the Constitution then to come back and try to get warrants for it. But then once you read it, there's been no actionable intelligence on this, but this is an active program that you've got. You work for the government. You should admit to us whether or not you have a program going after our speech.
Thank you, Senator Paul.
We investigate violence, not speech.
Thank you.
Republicans point at Democrats and say, we don't like your programs, let's cut your programs. Democrats look at Republicans and say, no, don't cut our programs, cut yours. Everybody's don't cut mine, cut yours. That's why I've taken the approach and continue to take the approach, we should cut everything across the board. In the past, there were always like conservatives who say, let's get rid of public television, let's get rid of Sesame Street and Big Bird, and they'd get so much grief over it. It's like, why do that? You're not balancing the budget over Big Bird. Take 1% of Big Bird's budget. Take 1% of everybody's budget. And what would that bring about? It would bring about more conservation of the dollar. It would bring about more restraint and more reform. I'll end with this. People say, where would you cut? I would say everywhere. But I can give you, on the tip of my hand, ridiculous stuff that should have 100% cut, but is never cut and goes on and on. In the early 1970s, William Proxmire, a conservative Democrat, pointed out that the National Science Foundation was spending $50,000 to study what makes people fall in love. Now, that's a better, I think, topic for Cosmopolitan magazine than it is for a government study. Nowadays, it's gone up. We spent $1 million having young people take selfies of themselves while smiling and then looking at it later in the day to see if looking at pictures of yourself smiling makes you a happier person. That cost you $1 million. We spent $1.5 million studying the mating call of the Panamanian frog to see if the mating call of the country frogs was different than the city frogs. We spent nearly $1 million studying the Japanese quail to see if they're more sexually promiscuous when they're on cocaine. I think we could have just polled the audience on that one. This is the kind of ridiculous stuff, but does it get better? I complain about this every year and all the time, and everybody shakes their head and says, no way, why are we doing that? The National Science Foundation, we increased their budget 50% last year. People said, oh, we have to compete with China, so let's give the National Science Foundation more money. We've almost increased their budget by 50%. The people are studying why you go on dates, why you're happy, why the male frogs, what their mating call is. This is the craziness, but it never gets better because we always spend more money. So my amendment would do this. My amendment would reduce the spending in real terms. We'd actually spend less money next year than last year. It'd be a 5% reduction in money, and you'd spend less each year, and over 5 years you'd balance your budget, and then we'd be on course to balance. People say, why not? Who can do this? Half of Europe does it. Sweden balances their budget. Germany balances their budget. Over half of the countries of Europe run an annual balanced budget. Our profligacy and our spending is catching up to us. I say we act now, and I recommend a yes.
The Church Committee issued its final report, revealing decades of widespread abuse by federal intelligence agencies against U.S. citizens. The Bipartisan Church Committee outlined countless examples of how the federal government used powers that were meant to counter foreign threats against its own citizens. In an effort to protect society, these abuses happened under presidents of both parties. Domestic groups like the NAACP and the Women's Liberation Group engaged in nonviolent, lawful political expression were targeted and surveilled for contradicting the approved government initiative and narrative. Intelligence agencies use their powers to serve ideological purposes, attempting to covertly influence social policy and political action. The government distorted and exaggerated facts, leveraged mass media, and attacked the leadership of groups it considered to be threats to the social order. One of these so-called threats to social order was Martin Luther King, Jr. The purpose of the Church Committee's years-long investigation was to expose the intelligence agency's unlawful overreach into the private lives of Americans. The committee hoped that its findings would result in more transparency and accountability to ensure that these abuses never occurred again. They say history repeats itself, doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. Unfortunately, as we sit here today, I fear that our federal government is still undertaking many of the same tactics that the Church Committee found to be unworthy of democracy and occasionally reminiscent of totalitarian regimes. Federal agencies, including the FBI and the DHS, continue to operate in a manner that is outside the scope of their authorities, wasting taxpayer dollars and infringing on the rights of Americans. Earlier this month, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals found that the federal agencies, including the FBI and DHS, likely violated the First Amendment. In fact, the judge said it was one of the worst, if not the worst, violation of the First Amendment in American history. By coercing social media companies to remove speech the government disagreed with related to the origins of COVID-19, pandemic lockdowns, vaccine efficacy, and the Hunter Biden laptop stories. FBI and DHS regularly met with social media companies and pressured them to remove content it deemed as misinformation, including posts and accounts that originated from within the United States and including posts and accounts that are verifiably true. And the censorship of the constitutionally protected speech on social media is just one example of the executive branch actions in recent years weaponizing the federal government against its people. The FBI continues to misuse its authority under Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. You would think we'd be going after foreigners, but we are using the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act to go after Americans, as we observed and was done with individuals participating in the George Floyd protests. Unconstitutional access to Americans' activities was instituted against those in the George Floyd protests. DHS warned of violence from Americans who questioned the efficacy and safety of the COVID-19 vaccines and protested government overreach associated with pandemic mitigation measures. These agencies, charged with protecting the security of our nation, targeted parents who protested restrictive COVID-19 policies at school board meetings and labeled Catholics as potential domestic terrorists. It is hardly a surprise that the faith of Americans in their government is dwindling. Instead of focusing on rampant violent crime across the nation and the unprecedented crisis at the border, FBI and DHS are using their resources to surveil and censor law-abiding Americans engaged in constitutionally protected speech. When the federal government's activities are improperly focused inward, legitimate national security threats go unnoticed. The Church Committee highlighted the important point, highlighting that the FBI placed more emphasis on domestic dissent than on organized crime. And its effort to combat foreign spies suffered because of its focus on American protest groups. The narratives from the past and the present draw a concerning parallel. The lessons of the Church Committee report resonate nearly 50 years later, yet the cycle of executive branch overreach continues. The American people deserve accountability from the federal government, and Congress cannot continue to abdicate its constitutional duty to conduct oversight. As the Church Committee aptly pointed out, power must be checked and balanced, and the preservation of liberty requires the restraint of laws. It is our responsibility to ensure that the principles of American democracy endure, and I hope my colleagues on both sides of the aisle will work with me to do just that.